So, welcome to our lecture with Antony Lerman from London about whatever happened to anti-Semitism. We have the great pleasure to do this event together with the Kreisky Forum for International Relations in Vienna. And so I also welcome not only Tony Lerman from London, but also Gertraud Auer from Vienna. And this is part of a series of events that take place at the Kreisky Forum under the headline Borders and Identities, but also is part of our program that accompanies the exhibition on taxidermized Jews, the history, presence, and future of Jewish museums and their subject. And we are glad to have you here, Tony. Not the first time. 4 years ago, together with the Kreisky Forum, we were able here to host an event to introduce your publication, Do I Belong? Reflections from Europe, which we were able to present here in Hohenems in 2018. And how this relates to the Kreisky Forum, you will tell us later in your lecture. Just to introduce you first to our audience here in Hohenems, but also on Zoom and on Facebook. Tony Lerman, after studying history in Great Britain, was active in numerous functions, doing research and fostering Jewish life in Europe, and doing research about anti-Semitism, being a member and then director of the Institute of Jewish Affairs in London. That was a research institute of the World Jewish Congress. You were editor of Patterns of Prejudice in London and the editor of Jewish Quarterly. You founded the Anti-Semitism World Report that you had from 1992 till 98, which was the first comprehensive report on developments of anti-Semitism in different countries. In 1996, you founded the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, and in 1999, you set up the first program of the Rothschild Foundation supporting Jewish life in Europe. So you tackled with the subject tonight from many and also institutional perspectives, but at some point in your life you decided to rather work independently, and I think that also will be a subject of tonight. Today you are a senior fellow at the Kreisky Forum in Vienna and also at the Parks Institute in Southampton for Jewish and non-Jewish relation, and beside the publication Do I Belong that we presented here 4 years ago, you're also the author of a book with the telling title, The Making and Unmaking of a Zionist, a Personal and Political Journey. Tonight we will together introduce you to the recent book that you just published, Whatever Happened to Anti-Semitism, and I'm most curious to listen to your lecture. Before that, I will hand over the mic to Gertraud Auer, who will also welcome us for the Kreisky Institute. Thank you, Gertraud, for being with us.
Thank you. After 7 hours train from Vienna to Hohenems this afternoon and back tomorrow, another 7 hours from Hohenems to Vienna. I'm very, very happy to be here with you and to share this evening with our dear friend Tony Lerman. I would also like to welcome Kathy Lerman, his wife, who is with us. And we have many years of common activities and of friendship, but also of professional activities together. I was hosting a group of intellectuals, academics, Jewish and non-Jewish, for several years in Vienna, called the Vienna Conversations. Out of these conversations, Tony published a volume called Do I Belong, that we presented also here in Hohenems. We have also a specific history with the Jewish Museum in Hohenems, and I'm very happy that I can be with you tonight here. We founded the Vienna Friendship Society for the Jewish Museum Jewish Museum Hohenems in Vienna to support projects from the museum in Vienna. We presented one exhibition in spring this year with several talks and events on the side. And we are going to continue to do the same next year. We try to raise money to support the Jewish Museum Hohenems in Vienna. And Hanno is also one of our curators in the Kreisky Forum, exactly to the topic borders and identities, which is also very much connected to what the Jewish Museum in Hohenems is doing. So we have many puzzles that bring us together. I'm very grateful to Tony to be here tonight and to share the talk and the lecture on this very thorny question of anti-Semitism, and on not only the question on anti-Semitism, but especially the debate around anti-Semitism, which is so thorny and which I think has no better place than the Jewish Museum in Hohenems to host. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gertraud. Just one note before we start with your lecture. We will have the possibility for you here in the auditorium to share questions and comments with us, but you also at home watching the event online have the possibility to raise questions or give your comments in the chat. So after Tony's lecture, you can type in your comments and questions in the chat at home, and we'll try to take them into the discussion here as best as we can. Let's see how many questions and comments it will be, but we will do our best to help you also to share the space, the virtual space with us tonight. So thank you very much. And Tony, now the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm delighted to be here tonight, and I want to thank my very good friends Hanno and Gertraud for inviting me to come and talk about my new book From Here in Hohenems. As you've heard, I've been here before with my wife Kathy in relation to another book in 2018, and it's a real pleasure to be back here again. As I say, we were here to launch the book of essays I commissioned and edited for the forum called Do I Belong? Reflections from Europe. And this was the outcome, as Gertraud says, of a series of discussions called the Vienna Conversations over a number of years from 2013. Now, my new book is, of course, connected to that project because, like all racisms, anti-Semitism is about depriving a group of the right to belong on the grounds of imagined, intolerable differences, singling them out for hate and dehumanization. For those of us who research and write about current anti-Semitism, it would be a relief to have the certainty that we were all talking about the same thing. But sadly, this is not the case, which is why I called my attempt to explain the reasons for this fractured condition, whatever happened to anti-Semitism. For contrary to what the initiators and promoters of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism would like us to believe, study and comment on the subject is mired in deep and bitter argument, not to mention confusion, ignorance, ad hominem attacks, and worse. How, for example, do you make sense of Trump, Putin, and Orban loving Israel and at the same time indulging in dog whistle anti-Semitism? Why are Jews who affirm that Israel is an apartheid state labeled anti-Semitic? And why are millions of evangelical Christians who envision Jewish apocalypse at the coming Armageddon fated in Israel as Jews' best friends? And why was a lifelong anti-racism campaigner, the former British Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn, accused of anti-Semitism and called an existential threat to British Jews? And I want to begin with the Corbyn question, if I can put it that way, because when I discussed my talk in advance with Hanno, he thought it'd be appropriate to start by saying something about this glaring British example of the confusion around anti-Semitism. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, or at least those who follow things going on in Britain, during the 5 years of Corbyn's leadership from 2015 to 2020, stories about rampant anti-Semitism in Britain were front-page news. And the subject still attracts media attention today. This was not the result of any major anti-Semitic incident like the 2018 Tree of Life synagogue bombing in Pittsburgh, or of any surveys in the UK showing an exponential increase in people expressing anti-Semitic sentiments. The UK was and remains arguably one of the safest countries in the world for Jews. A veteran far-left backbench MP, Corbyn has opposed all forms of racism, was a passionate supporter of Palestinian rights, and a serial socialist rebel, often voting against party policy. Until 2015, he had never sought high office, but reluctantly agreed to be the left's candidate in that year's leadership election. Losing seemed a foregone conclusion, but he emerged victorious, buoyed by an influx of younger members attracted by his radical agenda. So, where does the anti-Semitism come in? Well, as many of you surely know, within a year, the party was struggling to fend off charges of being overflowing with anti-Semites. Such people were said to be among the wave of younger members. Not only were they attracted by Corbyn's robust socialism, it was also said that they were comfortable with his alleged tolerance of the left-wing anti-Semitism behind the notion that Jewish bankers and billionaires were responsible for propping up capitalism. Not that any evidence was given that he thought or said any such thing. An apparent spike in complaints made to party officials about expressions of anti-Semitism at local party meetings appeared to back this up. At the same time, reports began to appear in the media allegedly proving that Corbyn himself had indulged in anti-Semitic behavior. Some of these reports linked Corbyn to Palestinian figures who, it was alleged, made no attempt to hide their anti-Semitic anti-Zionism. Now, the mainstream media couldn't get enough of these stories. Headlines appeared warning that Corbyn posed an imminent existential threat to British Jews, and that, as a result, many Jews were seriously considering leaving the country. The Board of Deputies of British Jews and the Israeli government made it clear that Corbyn's support for measures resisting occupation was unadulterated anti-Semitism. Corbyn, during all of this, consistently denied being anti-Semitic, repeatedly said there was no place for anti-Semites in the party, and directed that all measures against anti-Semitism in the party be strengthened. More than 4 years of relentless attacks on him ensued. Most of the mainstream media, dozens of his own MPs, and numerous media celebrities sought to engineer his downfall. Other political parties, the Church of England, and most of the rest of the establishment cheered them on. Jewish organizations and the official affiliate of the Labour Party itself, the Jewish Labour Movement, JLM, took to the streets to demonstrate their apparent disgust for Corbyn's apparent failure to rid the party of the alleged scourge of anti-Semitism and for his own anti-Semitism. An atmosphere of continuous crisis eventually culminated in a disastrous result in the 2019 general election, triggering Corbyn's resignation. So how realistic was this picture of a dangerously anti-Semitic party leader, idolized by legions of anti-Semitic party members? Well, let's look at some facts. Constantly in the public eye since he became an MP in 1983, Corbyn has been determinedly transparent about his political views. It therefore stands to reason that were he anti-Semitic, he'd have a substantial public track record of anti-Semitic behavior or expressions of anti-Semitic sentiment. Now, a computer search of UK newspapers produced the following. In the 2,476 articles about anti-Semitism from 1983 to 2014, none mention Jeremy Corbyn. In the 4,265 articles about Jeremy Corbyn in this period, none mention anti-Semitism. Then suddenly, in the period 2015 to 2019, there were 7,500 articles containing the words Corbyn and anti-Semitism. So, had he been magically hiding something all the time? Or are we looking at a concerted effort to bring him down from the moment he became leader in 2015? Corbyn had a long track record, both inside and outside Parliament, of supporting the safety and security of Jewish communities in the UK, and joining protests when Jews have been subject to anti-Semitic harassment. He also maintained very good relations with both secular and Orthodox Jewish communities in his London constituency. The notion that the Labour Party was a home for a disproportionately large number of anti-Semites also proved to be unfounded. Research showed that people with left-wing views are less likely to harbor anti-Semitic sentiments than those of right-wing views, and that members of the Tory party are significantly more likely to harbor anti-Semitic views than members of the Labour Party. Yet the public were convinced that Labour had a problem with anti-Semitism. A nationwide survey in 2019 found that the British public believed that 34% of Labour Party members had been accused of anti-Semitism. The actual figure at the time was less than 0.1% of members. Now, these are objective facts, I believe. You don't have to be a supporter of Corbyn to accept them. At the same time, his own alleged anti-Semitic misdemeanors were never proven. So how to explain the extraordinary gap between the characterization of Corbyn and the Labour Party in the media and public perception on the one hand, and on the other hand, hard evidence that this was massive distortion? Well, the truth, as I believe it, is that the crisis was arguably never really about anti-Semitism at all. First, the British establishment, most politicians and almost the entire mainstream media saw Corbyn as such a threat to the country, were he ever to become prime minister and implement his socialist policies, they united with those attacking him for anti-Semitism to vilify and undermine him from day one. Second, the so-called anti-Semitism crisis in Labour was essentially a proxy war waged by the Zionist-supporting Jewish Labour Movement, JLM, on the Corbyn-supporting other group, Jewish Voice for Labour, JVL, a non-affiliated group comprising non-Zionists and anti-Zionists. JLM, the Jewish Labour Movement, bitterly opposed to what they feared would be a decisive swing to support for Palestinian rights under Corbyn, weaponized anti-Semitism in its bid to keep Labour supportive of Zionism and the notion of a Jewish majority in Israel-Palestine in perpetuity. They were backed by virtue of all the mainstream and establishment organizations of the Jewish community. And this played out also in constituency labor branches across the country. For JLM, equal rights for Palestinians spelt the end of the Jewish state. Anti-Zionism and pro-Palestinianism were for them anti-Semitism. But for JVL, the Jewish Voice for Labor, Zionism was Jewish ethno-nationalism, discriminatory and racist, a form of apartheid. Now, the two coalitions of groups, the British establishment and the organized Jewish community, worked openly to unseat Corbyn, and they succeeded. And while national politics moved on, the consequence of the anti-Semitism furore was the bringing of bitter arguments over the contention that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, largely an intra-Jewish feud until then, into the public domain. This was significantly catalyzed and amplified by the ubiquity and influence of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, said by its promoters to be the internationally recognized gold standard definition, but ultimately a deeply flawed and dangerous document. Neither the messy end of the Labour anti-Semitism crisis, reverberations of which are still being felt in the UK, nor the relentless spread of IHRA, which also played a significant part in the Corbyn saga, brought clarity to the understanding of anti-Semitism. They only sowed further confusion. As Peter Beinart, American Jewish prominent commentator on these matters, puts it in his endorsement of my book, we're faced with a quote-unquote hot mess in which, quote, debate about anti-Semitism is both incoherent and appalling, end quote. And the Labour anti-Semitism saga is as glaring an example of the misunderstanding, ignorance, willful obfuscation, and politicization surrounding what is and what is not anti-Semitism, as one can find. Now, during recent years, there have been many attempts from different political and academic perspectives to explain the reasons for the hot mess, but also, and more often, attempts to deny that there was any genuine confusion on the grounds that it was just the anti-Semitism deniers who were confused, those who refused to accept that IHRA defined anti-Semitism once and for all. Nonetheless, a constant stream of controversies, most prominently the Labour anti-Semitism crisis, provided seemingly limitless material for continued bitter argument. I held the view that to fully understand what was going on, it was necessary to take into account the wider and longer historical and political context, and to bring to bear some new or neglected analytical approaches to our understanding of where we are now. And this is what I have aimed to do in my book. But experience comes into it too, and Hanno, in his recitation of my biography, explained that I've worked for many years in research and study on anti-Semitism. So experience comes into it. The underpinning of the book is research-based and academic, but also has a unique first-person dimension that is usually excluded from contemporary anti-Semitism studies. I begin by quoting data from polls showing widespread public confusion and ignorance about anti-Semitism and what the word means, and deep division over it among Jews. Media disinformation and exaggeration about the current danger of anti-Semitism by Jewish defense and representative organizations made matters worse. I pay special attention in the book to one particular area of confusion, the use and abuse of anti-Semitic stereotypes and tropes. For example, the words Jews and media appearing in the same sentence is not automatically an anti-Semitic trope, as some people seem to feel. Neither is the phrase Jewish power. This undermines our understanding what a trope is. Much of the confusion is closely linked to the question of the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which itself is central to the notion of what came to be called the new anti-Semitism. For many Jewish observers, the alleged existence of this phenomenon proved that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are one and the same. But I show in the book that over the last 40 years, anti-Semitism has been redefined as new anti-Semitism, a notion that only fully emerged in the 1980s, said to be anti-Israel, left-wing and Islamic group opposition to the Jewish state, both when discussed in the public space and as a subject of academic study. Though strong opposition to it exists and persists. Central to that redefinition is the myth of the collective Jew, the resonant metaphor for Israel defined as the Jewish state. In tracing the concept of new anti-Semitism, I explain how the idea developed from the 1970s, arising out of the angry reaction among Jewish groups and Israel's supporters to the adoption of UN General Assembly Resolution 3379 in 1975, which determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. I followed the course of discussion through the 1980s and 90s on anti-Semitism, Zionism, and anti-Zionism in conferences and seminars and relevant publications, and focused on the thinking of a few people whose teaching, writing, and interventions in public debates were especially influential on the way that the new anti-Semitism and collective Jew discourses became dominant and was skillfully used to disseminate the notion of new anti-Semitism. The collapse of communism in 1989 brought welcome freedoms for all, but also a resurgence of popular anti-Semitism generated by new groups nostalgic, quote unquote, for the fascist and Nazi traditions pre-1939. There was some panic over that resurgence at the time, but it dissipated. So much so that by the turn of the century, new anti-Semitism was well on the way to becoming the orthodox understanding of anti-Semitism. Now, this did not come about by discussions alone. An institutional infrastructure developed, in part politically coordinated, within which new anti-Semitism theory was fleshed out and disseminated. Of crucial importance to this was the Israeli government's decision in 1988 to establish the Government Monitoring Forum on Anti-Semitism, with the aim of implementing a new policy with the help of the Mossad, the Israel intelligence agency, putting Israel at the head of international Jewish efforts to combat anti-Semitism, increasingly focused on alleged anti-Semitic criticism of Israel. This policy waxed and waned during the 1990s as implementing the Oslo Accords dominated Israel's agenda. But by 2000, most Jewish organizations worldwide, some previously somewhat skeptical, fell in line, and Israel engaged in exploiting the issue of anti-Semitism more seriously. The central tenet of new anti-Semitism, Israel as the persecuted collective Jew among the nations, though contested throughout the 1990s and beyond, ultimately became, through pressure from institutions, academics, and activists, the main plank of the dominant discourse about anti-Semitism. But the key turning point was 9/11. Reports of an explosion of global anti-Semitism, whatever that actually means, said to be directed largely at Israel, led to new anti-Semitism discourse becoming ever more dominant. Israel reacted by reconfiguring and upgrading the status of its institutions dealing with anti-Semitism at the governmental level in the early 2000s, and strengthened its developing world leadership role, determinedly weaponizing anti-Semitism to deflect criticism of its policies. The scene was then set for a decisive step change, the codification of new anti-Semitism in the working definition of anti-Semitism published on the website of the European Union Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia, the EUMC, in 2005. This was the result of a political project that emerged out of the development of the new anti-Semitism institutional infrastructure. Participants invited to contribute to discussions about that new definition had to be sympathetic to new anti-Semitism analysis. Now, an informal, practical understanding of anti-Semitism had prevailed for decades among anti-Semitism researchers. But the heads of the Jewish groups driving the EUMC discussions insisted that there was a clamor for a new definition without which new anti-Semitism could not be successfully combated. They subsequently claimed that this was the result of years of scholarly research and discussion. But I can tell you that there was no clamor, and combating anti-Semitism was not in crisis, nor was it a lengthy process. In fact, it was originally and fundamentally, as I've said, a political project opportunistically planned and implemented by a small group behind closed doors. It wasn't an open-ended academic endeavor. Nevertheless, new anti-Semitism theory radically broke that consensus. The EUMC working definition destroyed it completely. Post 9/11, the growing new anti-Semitism institutional infrastructure helped generate and amplify a moral panic. In a very significant move, Israel finally committed itself to full occupation of the leadership role in the fight against new anti-Semitism. By the early 2010s, Israeli government and state institutions and agencies were contributing decisively to coordinating anti-Semitism activity in many countries. While the EUMC working definition had achieved significant international attention and approbation, the organization's successor, the Fundamental Rights Agency, the FRA, distanced itself from the text. But under pressure from the major US Jewish organizations in particular, and backed by the Israeli government, it was reintroduced with marginal changes into the public domain by the IHRA in 2016. It was assiduously disseminated by IHRA officials and the Jewish organizations and quickly attracted very favorable international attention. At this point in the book, with IHRA providing Israel with unprecedented cover for its anti-Palestinian agenda, I deconstruct the narrative at the heart of the working definition, the notion of Israel, the persecuted collective Jew among the nations, which is both metaphor and concept. I expose this as a myth. A state cannot have the attributes of a human being. Furthermore, by making the state untouchable, the myth encourages its deification. From a Jewish religious point of view, this is idolatrous. And it's anti-Semitic too, because the parallel reduces the Jew to a singularity, implying that all Jews are the same, an obvious anti-Semitic trope. And finally, the concept is also blatantly racist in another sense. It completely erases the Palestinian minority from the Israeli reality. I also demonstrate how Israel leverages its very favorable geopolitical situation, its status as probably the leading military and economic power in the region, its normalizing of relations with many Arab states, and its fruitful relations with Russia, China, and India, to secure acquiescence in the government's portrayal of the state as under attack from viral anti-Semitic delegitimization. Briefly, first, so I then discuss 4 other anti-Semitism linked discourses that are also deployed to reinforce the collective Jew myth. Briefly, first, the insistence that nothing less than eradication, elimination, or rooting out of anti-Semitism are acceptable strategies for dealing with a problem. We may, of course, yearn for the end of anti-Semitism, but like any racism, eradicating it is impossible. But constantly demanding it serves the interests of new anti-Semitism warriors because it sanctions the continuity of complaint which acts as a permanent barrier to the attainment of justice for the Palestinians. Second, the widespread use of wholly inappropriate medical analogies, principally seeing anti-Semitism as a virus. Such analogies rarely come with proposed cures, and they turn anti-Semites, for whom anti-Semitism is a choice, into unwitting victims. Third, apocalypticism, that is, repeated prophecies of anti-Semitic Armageddon. The prophets of anti-Semitic doom, journalists, activists, academics alike, see all Jews as vulnerable, but most serious is the alleged ever-present threat of annihilation of Israel by hostile forces. Belief sustains this narrative, not evidence. So it matters not if it doesn't happen. And if the apocalyptic claims are questioned, it's the questioner who comes under suspicion for downplaying or denying anti-Semitism. And finally, we've seen increasing reference to acting against anti-Semitism as a war, even though you cannot fight a war against an abstract noun. I argue that it's not enough to defend use of the term war because it is only a metaphor. It dangerously raises expectations as to what can be achieved. Moreover, the use of the word reveals much about the problematic nature of anti-Semitism activity. For even the generals waging the so-called war acknowledge that they are failing. It's not being won. The anti-Semitism reports they present us with consistently show anti-Semitism getting worse. They will hardly ever criticize those prophesying an imminent apocalypse. They stand before parliamentary select committees, US congressional hearings, and UN committees and speak of the existential dangers posed by current anti-Semitism. And since they and the politicians they are addressing will be satisfied with nothing less than complete eradication of anti-Semitism, and at the same time, they're speaking of it as an incurable disease, they are, I would argue, in a double bind. But as they are the main voices being listened to, they monopolize and control the narrative. Armed with the IHRA working definition, they present themselves as the experts, more or less admitting that the situation is beyond anyone's control. And they get away with portraying failure as success by, in effect, saying that there is no alternative, that others offering a different approach, one that rejects IHRA, are anti-Semitism deniers. That different approach is largely rooted in the post-Holocaust imperative of respecting human rights for all. And of course, it's perfectly reasonable to frame the fight against anti-Semitism as a human rights cause. It's therefore highly incongruous that the campaign to protect the collective Jew displays so many elements that run counter to human rights values. Of course, there are many working to combat real anti-Semitism who genuinely are still inspired by such values and fully realize that they must apply to Palestinians too. But I show that seeing Israel as the persecuted collective Jew among the nations is reinforced by the attack by Jewish groups on human rights culture and organizations for being an alleged anti-Semitic conspiracy against the Jewish state. For those prosecuting the alleged war on anti-Semitism, human rights advocacy has become the enemy of Jews, and specifically the enabler of anti-Semitic anti-Zionism. Thus, for them, there is no incongruity in adhering to new anti-Semitism theory, designating Palestinians, along with the left and Muslims, as responsible for it, and therefore forfeiting their right to seek justice grounded in human rights values. In reality, therefore, the war's principal victims are the Palestinians, denied democracy, freedom, and equality. The so-called war on anti-Semitism is also essentially an elite enterprise dominated by governing structures and official bodies. It's not a social movement. There are no grassroots clamoring or mobilizing for action. Its leaders expect to address and influence establishments, security forces, governments. They're accountable to no one, and their sources of funding are not transparent. A war on anti-Semitism led by Israel, I contend, is a war being fought with Zionism as the weapon. This is a contradiction in terms and an impossibility, not only because it would mean fighting one racism with another, but also because at its very core, Zionism endorses an anti-Semitic construction of the Jew. Anti-Semitism nurtured and empowered Zionism. It was mobilized for the sake of the Zionist project. Herzl wrote in his diary, I quote, "The anti-Semites will become our most loyal friends. The anti-Semitic nations will become our allies," end quote. In the 1930s, David Ben-Gurion said, quote, "Le malheur of the Jews was the chance of Zionism," end quote. And the Israeli historian Edith Zertal has described the diaspora Jew as the first other of Zionism, against which Zionism defended itself. And with this, in conclusion, I return to IHRA. The Jew is once again the victim of Zionism because by IHRA defining anti-Semitism as what it is not, free speech on Palestine, Israel, real anti-Semitism is given a free pass. Sense on anti-Semitism is undermined. It now seems that while anti-Semitism was once about who hates Jews, it's now about who Jews hate. It's a tragedy that the redefinition process has produced a charter for pursuing an anti-Palestinian agenda. From its first appearance, the notion of the new anti-Semitism was being used to progressively undermine and deprive Palestinians of opportunities to speak of the Nakba, their ongoing experience of ethnic cleansing, dispossession, and apartheid, Israel's discriminatory laws that made it a racist endeavor, a political and ideological agenda now driving Israel's far-right and fascist incoming government. IHRA undermines Palestinians' struggle for their fundamental human rights by being used to judge the deployment of non-violent forms of protest, such as boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and rights advocacy to be anti-Semitic. Already often placed in legal jeopardy for these activities. With IHRA, Palestinians now found themselves branded as the principal purveyors of anti-Semitism. And despite explicitly defined as not legally binding, IHRA has been used to open up even more legal pathways to their cancellation. The book starts with confronting confusion and ends with the stark reality of its consequences. Anti-Zionism, a form of legitimate political discourse and belief, has been conflated with anti-Semitism, a form of racial hostility and hatred. This equation, labeled New Anti-Semitism, which targets the collective Jew, a bogus metaphor and concept, was codified in the form of the IHRA working edition of anti-Semitism, with the result that anti-Semitism has been redefined to be what it is not. Redefinition has resulted in the production of a racist charter actively applied against the Palestinians based on the prohibition of freedom of speech. Jews have been made no safer by this outcome. When leaders such as Trump, Orban, Morawiecki, Bolsonaro, and other right-wing populists who promote white supremacy and either condone or even deploy expressions of anti-Semitism are fated for their support of IHRA and Israel. We know that the necessary struggle against real anti-Semitism is being unjustifiably and dangerously neglected. Thank you.
Your book is thick of research, thick of also some toppling of taboos, and it raises a lot of questions. And just when I try to think of the days in which we are today, with the elections in the US, the outcome that we will see in the next days, elections in a country where figures show that those who support Israel at most are those who are expressing most explicitly anti-Semitic ideology. It's the same people. All the polls show that the supporters of Trump, who are most loyal to Israel in its current politics, are the most anti-Semitically thinking people in the US. When you watch the elections in Brazil, where the First Lady, Michelle Bolsonaro, went to the vote with a T-shirt showing the Israeli flag as something she wanted to communicate to their evangelical supporters who are composing the mass base of Bolsonaro in Brazil. And I could continue with a lot of these examples about these people you mentioned in the end of your talk. Mm-hmm. There's just one point in which I can't follow you and your book, which is maybe a minor point, or it opens to a much bigger question. Is it really the Palestinians who are the target of these new strategies, or is it democracy? Is it liberal constituency of what we know as Europe or the US or whatever? Is it just a tiny population of Palestinians, or is it much more attacking the basics of our life everywhere and the life of Jews who are dependent on liberal constituencies wherever they live, inside Israel even? So that is just one narrowing in your argument that I would debate a little, because I have the impression that all this is not because of Israel and Palestine, but because of the interests of Trumpists and evangelicals and Orbans and national conservative, far right, whatever groups in Europe and the US, in Great Britain, in South America, wherever you look at.
Well, if you say that that IHRA, which symbolizes what you're talking about, if you say that IHRA is damaging in a very broad way, because it feeds into post-truth agendas, it feeds into all kinds of illiberal agendas and so on, I would agree with you completely. I don't think there's anything in my book which contradicts that. But I would argue very strongly that the principal people affected by the developments that I write about and the redefinition of anti-Semitism are, at the end of the day, the Palestinians. So I think there's a bit of a danger here in spreading this thing too widely, because there again, there's always something which takes focus of attention away from the Palestinians. I mean, the Israelis are past masters at this in what they accuse them of. So I think really it's important to focus on the fact that what I'm talking about in my book is principally something which affects them. It indeed is symbolic of other very negative developments in the world and society. But I think in this case, we have to focus on, it's very important to focus on the impact on Palestinians.
I very often just ask myself where the energy is coming from that makes this possible. And I mean, talking about the IHRA, I know quite a number of people who were actively working in this international structure for many years, for all kinds of good reasons. And when legislations all over Europe started to implement the IHRA definition, which is in fact the definition that existed 10 years already before, with mostly no alteration, basically. And I asked several people who were active in IHRA, and they were present in the Bucharest conference where it was decided, how it came that you clever people working on anti-Semitism, Holocaust studies, whatever, for many, many years, did agree on that. The answer was, we didn't agree on that. It was decided when we all had already left, when the politicians were still there, but the experts already left the conference. And it was not really decided upon. It was not even, it was never discussed in the IHRA. It was, I mean, it was prefabricated already. It was never discussed in the IHRA. And it was not even rightly decided upon. The IHRA decided upon the 4 lines of the basic definition that basically says nothing. I mean, it says anti-Semitism is to hate Jews, which is not a very helpful definition if you want to explain anything. And that all the rest of the text was simply taken for granted. It was taken, but it was not decided. It was not discussed. So it was just a political drama to use that. And the question is, why representatives of the political scene in so many countries, and there were no Jews, there were simply politicians coming there, what was the energy behind accepting this definition and then making it into legislation, or even, or at least in resolutions of parliaments that are semi-legal, using that? And why people like Mark Weitzman and Rabbi Baker from the American Jewish Committee, who pressured this definition into the IHRA when it was shelved already in the EU, why they had this stage to do that. And I think Bolsonaro has no issue with the Palestinians. He has an issue with Israel because Israel is now the holy cow of the evangelicals and other right-wing nationalists everywhere in the world. So what the interesting thing, and you show that in your book very precisely, is that in a way, Jews, from being the target, from being the scapegoat, the myth of a scapegoat, particularly the myth of the wandering Jew, the non-national Jew, the cosmopolite, that was the scapegoat of anti-Semitism. But now Israel became the holy cow of all kind of right-wing nationalism everywhere in the world. And I think this is the energy that makes it possible that people like the people you name, who work in these kind of institutes, are successful.
Well, that's a view. I think you cover a lot of ground there, Hanno, and I think, you know, to give a full answer to all of the points would take a long time. So let me just try and unpack a bit, because first of all, this notion that IHRA has been brought into legislation into various countries. Well, it's not quite like that, actually. There have been, and there are attempts, particularly in America, to bring it in, to legislate it in individual states and so on, and even at the government level. But it's important to point out that the IHRA working definition itself says this is not a legally binding definition and shouldn't be used, right? And its original drafter, Ken Stern, of the American Jewish Committee, back in 2004, 2005, has said that the way it is being used and put it into legislation is wrong. So that sort of adds to your original picture about, you know, how the thing got through this organization, the IHRA. But there's another, I think, much more important point, and that is, you know, if you're a member of an organization called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, are you really, first of all, if you're in that organization, you're obviously going to say that you're sensitive to issues to do with it, with the Holocaust. And are you then going to turn around and question what the organization says it has done in adopting this definition? I think not, because we still live in a world where image of the Holocaust and use of the Holocaust has an impact, and unlikely that you're going to go against that. Also, because if one of the reasons why most of these countries are members of the IHRA is purely as a kind of virtue signaling. They're trying to whitewash their own pasts, and they do it by being members of IHRA, supporting this definition, and this definition being clearly focused largely at things to do with Israel. But you're absolutely right. This definition was really born in sin, because some very serious study has been done on what actually went on 2016 in Bucharest. And it was shown, and the problem in doing this work was that most delegations didn't want to say what actually happened. But what apparently was decided was that this definition was, it's in two parts. There's a bit of short thing you referred to in a box, and then there's all the examples. And the real decision that was taken there, although nobody really fully understood this, was that only the thing in the box is the definition and not the examples. But immediately after it was over, or even before it was over, the IHRA itself, and particularly the German delegation and Mr. Klein, I think it is, who's the Jewish representative to the government in Germany.
He's not Jewish.
No, he's not Jewish.
He's not Jewish.
Okay, anyway, never mind.
He's one of these not Jewish politicians who make a holy cow out of Israel.
Right. Yeah. Well, anyway, they immediately went into overdrive to say that the whole thing is the definition. And indeed, one of the principal bodies that reinforced that was the British experts delegation to the IHRA, which issued a statement at the time when the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, was being pressured to adopt the IHRA, but wanted to make a few amendments to it. The British delegation said no amendments are allowed. Any amendments totally invalidate the definition, and therefore it's like Holy Writ, sacrosanct, and you've just got to take it or leave it. And that statement was then disseminated by the IHRA Secretariat itself as being their decision too. So you had really, in effect, wool being pulled over people's eyes at the Bucharest meeting, and then subsequently this notion that the whole thing is the definition entering into public discourse and the ether, and that is the situation we have now in the world. So I think that ultimately, one of the reason why IHRA has become so ubiquitous is because of the fact that it is so heavily linked to Holocaust and to guilt and those kinds of things.
That was the main coup, that they linked it by placing it into the basket of the IHRA. It didn't work well when it was put in the basket of the EU Monitoring Center Against Racism. That was a basket that was a bit awkward for the intention of this definition. And the interesting thing is that the main author or coordinator of this first version, Kenneth Stern, already, and that's also something to learn from your book, already in 2010 or so, warned against the weaponizing of it. And the interesting thing is that the and not everybody, if you know the exact wording of this IRA thing, but the interesting sentence that creates this kind of ambiguity that makes possible every kind of misuse of it is a sentence saying that anti-Semitism can also be directed against the state of Israel, perceived as a Jewish collective, which is interesting because it's majorly Zionism who perceives Israel as a Jewish collective and not those who criticize Israel. Even some do, and that certainly very often leads to certain expressions of anti-Semitism if you by criticizing Israel, identifying all Jews with the state. But the interesting thing is that this ambiguity makes it possible to denounce every form of criticism of Israel as an expression of anti-Semitism. And that works very cleverly. And I mean, just a few days ago, there's an initiative trying to fight against the adoption of the IHRA definition by the UN. The EU representative for, I don't know exactly the name of it, combating anti-Semitism, Ms. Schnurbein, explained to those who criticized the IHRA definition with saying our definition of anti-Semitism is victim-based. I mean, that sounds very good. I mean, that the victims of something are the main authority to define what it is. It sounds wonderful. If you look a little more closely into it, it becomes absurd because they say we made polls with 16,000 Jews in Europe, mostly affiliated with Jewish communities, so not really representing all those Jews who are not feeling so close to Jewish communities because they are out of the picture already. And 38 of these people asked said every criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, whatever you say. And 82 say everything related to boycott is anti-Semitic. First of all, I, as a German Jew, don't feel a victim of BDS. I'm against it, but I'm not a victim of it. Only if I would be an Israeli Jew who is strongly affiliated to Israel, I might feel as a victim, but as a German Jew, I'm not even feeling as a victim. So I ask myself, how can I, as a non-victim, say I'm a victim of something? But the interesting thing is, if you take the same logic to, let's say, an Iraqi Muslim living in Vienna who would say, I'm a victim of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, you would already say, well, are you really a victim of this occupation as an Iraqi Jew living in Vienna or London or Vancouver or wherever? And if this Iraqi Jew would say, an Iraqi Muslim would say, as a victim of the Israeli occupation, I define Israel as the second Holocaust or whatever he could say. Would it be a serious basis for an EU definition, victim-based? I mean, it gets more absurd every day. But I think your example talking about Britain in the beginning made so clear that it's not, there's so much interest invested in it. I mean, parts of the Labour Party and the other parties at the Church of England, they probably killed Corbyn not because of Israel and Palestine, because they wanted to kill him, and they used for a good reason. They were looking for a good reason, and they used what was on the table for them, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's very important, this victim-based question, because of course, with anti-Semitism, with any kind of racism, I think you have to listen to the victims, or the children of the victims, or whatever. You have to listen to the people who are affected by that, and of course, there's been, I think, not only in the UK, but a lot of controversy around police investigations of racist incidents, because police have been found to be unconsciously biased, sometimes biased, and not listening to what victims say. And so in the UK, for example, there was a report after the murder of a black teenager, which resulted in a major inquiry into this whole, what was called institutional racism in the police. And it was decreed and decided in a report that the police must listen. If somebody says, this is a racist incident that's occurred to me, then they have to register that so that that's on record. They weren't doing that. But it was very clearly determined also in that report on that nonetheless, whether it really was or was not a racist incident is for the law to decide. Yeah. Right? So this whole idea that Schnurbein comes along and says, well, you know, our support for IHRA because it's victim-based, I think is absurd, because you cannot base a definition of racism purely on what the victims say. If that was the case, you could get all kinds of groups coming forward and saying, well, you know, I'm being persecuted, the Scientologists, or this one's that one, and you'd be in a complete mess. So I don't think Jews should be privileged, or any other group should be privileged in this sense. There has to be an objective standard. So I think Schnurbein saying that, well, we polled 18,000 people or something like that really doesn't stand up.
I just want to mention that the chat is open for anybody who likes to join in. And I also would think that you here should have a chance to join in this discussion. There is a microphone. You have to use it, because if not, nobody in the internet can listen to you. So if you would love to join in the discussion, please give us a signal. And yeah, also to all those in the chat, please make use of it. I'm quite sure you have questions. The first one is always the difficulties. Wait. There's nothing in the chat yet. I'm surprised.
Or is this a sign of complete agreement?
Yes, I mean, if that's taken as a vote, I wouldn't be serious about that. But Marianne, wait a second, you need the mic. So nobody could hear you if you don't use it.
Ja. Also ich habe vieles wahrscheinlich nicht verstanden, aber Kritik an Israel, wenn ich bin 2010 seitdem nicht mehr in Berlin gewesen, aber vorher war ich in Berlin ein paar Jahre. Kritik an Israel war in Deutschland, wurde das als antisemitisch betrachtet. Und das durfte man überhaupt nie äußern. Und dieses ganze Zeug mit Antisemitismus, also ich habe nicht wenige Bekannte. Und keiner hat direkt in der letzten Zeit etwas Ähnliches erlebt, was man so bezeichnen könnte. Nur in den Zeitungen. Und diese Geschichte mit Corbyn, ja, das ist britisch.
So Marianne, you said that when you were in Berlin in the years before,
yeah,
you experienced that people who said critical things about Israel were accused. to be anti-Semitic, but you think this did not happen in the last
Nein, wenn man sich, ich bin, vielleicht muss ich sagen, dass ich nicht sehr politisch denke, wahrscheinlich, weiß ich nicht. Aber ich finde sehr vieles in Israel, was mir nicht gefällt, was ich mit Humanismus, wofür sich das Judentum enorm stark macht, Menschlichkeit und so, habe ich nicht entdecken können. Und ich finde einfach, dass das viel zu viel Feindlichkeit in beiden Bevölkerungen in Israel vorhanden ist. Die sehen immer nur die Feinde, alle. Und das führt nicht in die Zukunft. Das führt nur zu totalem Chaos.
I have to translate a bit of that to Tony. Yeah. She says that she experienced so much hostility in both camps of both parts of the Israeli society, and that does not lead to any better future. I have here a few comments in the chat now. There is a critical comment by Hanna Spiegler. She says, to say that there's no proof of Corbyn's anti-Semitism seems not honest to me. What Lerman says to Corbyn's friendship with Hamas and other terrorist leaders, there's a question. And among BDS, there are many supporters who are completely ignorant about the situation in Israel-Palestine and are boycotting left-wing Israeli artists, academics, writers, and others whom they are accusing of being fascists. I think we are not contributing to a more constructive discussion about anti-Semitism and the situation in Israel-Palestine by being blind on one eye and seeing black and white. We must confront the problems of both sides and listen to each and building the ground of trust. That it will be maybe more difficult for populists to instrumentalize this ongoing conflict as anti-Semitism. Just to mention, I'm an Israeli Swiss citizen and disgusted of Israeli racist, fascist politicians and their supporters and their behavior. So in that question, on comment, there are different layers. One, the criticism of BDS, which is not, as I see it, saying that BDS per se is all over anti-Semitic, but she criticized in particularly all the boycott actions that are directed against individuals. And there's a question that's very precise about Corbyn's friendship with Hamas. You have to say something about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll start with that. Yeah.
Let's start with that.
Well, Corbyn can speak for himself on this and has spoken for himself on this, and this is an issue that keeps coming up. I think all this arose because he chaired a meeting on Israel-Palestine where he referred to people on the panel. I think there was a Hamas representative. There were other people. He referred to some of the people as my friends from Hamas, or my friends, and so on. And this was taken to people interpreted this to say, well, these are his real friends. This is the people who he mixes with and who believes in, and so on and so forth. And they're anti-Semitic, and therefore he's anti-Semitic. Whereas, I think, to be fair, if anyone knows the history of Jeremy Corbyn and his activism in this kind of area, he's someone who's passionately, perhaps too passionately, wanting peace, right, with everyone. And therefore, you treat everybody equally. you know, you have these meetings, you speak to whoever you can. If you can speak to terrorists to get peace, you've got to speak to terrorists to get peace. You know, if you've got to bring people together whose views you don't agree with, you still, you do that. And you do it in a polite way. You bring them together and you say, my friend here, my friend there, etc., etc. The idea that that kind of discourse is somehow, you know, saying, oh, I love Hamas's charter, which says X, Y, Z about Jews and they should be destroyed, I think is completely absurd. So I really don't think that that is an argument to put against, I think, the much more weightier evidence that Corbyn had no animosity to Jews whatsoever. And the idea that if you sit down and talk with terrorists, that means you're going to have animosity to Jews. Well, tell that to Tony Blair when, or even the Thatcher government when they had people sitting down and talking with IRA terrorists. And not only that, let's face it, in Israel, you know, do you think therefore that no Israeli politician has ever, you know, sat down with Hamas and had discussions with Hamas about what might possibly? Of course, there have been things going on behind the scenes. So this kind of purity of, well, you know, can't go anywhere near someone who is a Hamas leader is, I think, really, it's essentially absurd also, because indeed, how can you, if you really want peace in Israel-Palestine, not find a way of talking to all the groups that are involved? You may not like them, you may not agree, you know, you may dislike a lot of what they say, but if you can't somehow bring them into a discussion about human rights and self-determination of people as well as peoples, then I think, you know, we're on a hiding to nothing.
I have more questions and comments in the chat. There is Laila Al-Subaidi. Thank you very much for this important event. What concrete consequences will it have if the UN adopts the IHRA definition? Do we have any idea what will make the difference?
Well, I don't know. I think Gertrude and I, we were talking about this earlier, actually, will it make any difference? Well, I think it would make a difference. I think every step that is taken towards further legitimization of IHRA, especially at the international level, only entrenches it even more and makes it even harder to fight, to, as I feel is important, fight against. Whether it would get through, whether it even gets as far as actually being voted on, I don't know the full details of it. I only learned about this myself a few days ago, that there was an attempt being made to get the UN to adopt IHRA, and there's already been a pushback by the academics who are involved in the framing and production of the Jerusalem Declaration on anti-Semitism, which is supposed to be an alternative to IHRA. So there's already an effort to push back, but I'm rather pessimistic in the sense that that in the situation in the world that we are in now, which you've so eloquently described early on in this discussion, with all kinds of negative things, post-truth, etc., things that have produced Trump and so on and so forth, that that the geopolitics of all of this, of which Israel is an important player these days because of its arms industry, because of the fact that a lot of countries look towards it, the authoritarian countries look towards Israel as an example of the kind of ethno-national state that they want. And because, a lot of voting in the UN is about, well, how do I appease or please this one that I want to stay friendly with, or this superpower that I've got to have good relations with. It wouldn't surprise me if it was adopted, but and I would say that it's definitely a negative development, and just goes to show how far this dangerous. I really do feel it is dangerous so-called definition, which isn't even a definition. But if you look in the dictionary for the definition of a definition, it's a short, succinct explanation of something. Well, the IHRA working definition is over 500 words long, so it doesn't even qualify as a definition. But the fact that we can't even get simple, logical arguments like that put in front of people so that they put it aside,
I mean,
it's something we have to live
that
with.
leads to the next question from Ralf Deja in Munich, who asks, what's your position on the Jerusalem Declaration on anti-Semitism, which has more than 500 words, but it doesn't say it's a definition. It says it's a declaration. So what is your opinion about that? I mean, as an attempt to direct the discussion into whatever other direction.
Well, I have to be perfectly honest about this because there's a paragraph in my book about my view about the Jerusalem Declaration. Well, I think, first of all, the thing to say is that there's no doubt that it is a vast improvement on the IHRA definition. If you want and you need a long definition of anti-Semitism, then definitely the JDA is superior. And I think it's a bit of a sleight of hand. I know that they say it's only the opening paragraph, which is the definition of the JDA, but the fact that it is got all the examples and the other stuff follows immediately on from it, and therefore it looks so much like the IHRA definition. I think most people are looking at it and feeling, well, actually it's the whole thing that is the definition. And I have been on record for years, way back from when the 2005 EUMC working definition, which it's still fundamentally that text, which is now saying that we don't need long definitions. It doesn't help anyone. What any definition has saved any Jew anywhere. So I think the whole notion that having the correct, perfect definition is going to, save Jews and combat anti-Semitism doesn't seem to me to make any sense. So I would have thought it would have been better for there to have been a different kind of strategy adopted where one went short rather than long, and then dealt with the issue of, okay, so how do you then deal with this example, that example? Well, you can deal with examples of whether things are anti-Semitism or not by going to experts, getting their opinions, research, etc., etc., etc. You don't, to try and stuff into a definition so many examples of what it is. It just, as I say, invalidates the notion that it's a definition. So I think it's an improvement, and it's important that it's there, JD. And I know that there have been successes in the UK, even in some pushing back in universities, where universities have adopted IHRA, and attempts have been made to get them to abandon that and take on the Jerusalem Declaration. The University of Aberdeen very recently decided that. There have been successes with it. So it's, it's a very worthy and important document, but unfortunately, I think, we need other strategies if we're really going to invalidate the IHRA definition.
There's one very precise question, and I try to do justice to everything that is coming up here. So maybe we try to be shorter. Anyway, Anna just asked a very precise question about the IHRA, referring to the sentence I mentioned that is not part of the definition, but part of the introduction of the examples with the criticism of Israel as a Jewish collective. The Germans really incorporated that sentence that is decided of the IHRA not to be part of the definition as if it was. Did other states did that same? That's the question.
I haven't heard of any other state that's done the same.
There was a very special German thing to just take this one sentence and put it into the definition where it does not belong. There are several
I think, by the way, there are examples, I think, of some other countries tampering with it a bit also. So maybe it's not only the Germans, but that's very glaring error, to say the least.
So there are a few comments on the BDS question. There's one comment by Miriam Halberstam. She says there's a clear difference between criticism on Israel and anti-Semitism, which we probably would not debate. And she says every leftist could criticize Israel, but boycott is something that is no criticism, which is also true because it's activism. But the question is still, is every activism anti-Semitism? But let's add to this question the other one, and that is a question from Facebook. You stated that IHRA would undermine Palestinian struggle by framing organizations as BDS as anti-Semitic. BDS was co-founded by the Palestinian National and Islamic Forces, which has members as Hamas and Islamic Jihad. That does not sound like new anti-Semitism to me, rather like old anti-Semitism. Therefore, isn't it BDS itself which is undermining the Palestinian struggles and human rights? I would add to that something that I also would like to know, and that is, wouldn't it be much easier to fight for the Palestinian rights and also to fight against Israeli, not only politics, but the kind of constitution it gives itself as a Jewish ethno-nationalist state, by not adopting BDS as a counter-strategy that says that the liberation of Arab soil is a primary goal, because that is definitely not criticism. It's not only activism, but it's definitely another ethno-national fight, which I would like not to be partisan in that other direction as well.
Yeah, but
so wouldn't it be easier to position a legitimate criticism of Israel as a Jewish state, which is in the eyes of many, you quote, you talk about already anti-Semitism, I know, but wouldn't it be much easier, or at least more legitimate, to place this criticism of ethno-nationalism independent from nationalistic Palestinian strategies, which are not anti-Semitic per se, but even as being nationalistic, I would not be very sympathetic for them.
Well, there is a case indeed to argue this out on the basis of nationalism. There shouldn't be any nationalism, and certainly there shouldn't be any ethno-nationalism. But we live in a world in which there is nationalism. I'm very anti-nationalist. That's what led me to give up my Zionism and so on. So I think it's very important that the anti-nationalist voice and reasons has to be put. But you know, this is taking us away from what's happening to the Palestinians. The Palestinians are suffering under an apartheid regime. This has been clearly established by human rights organizations in Israel and outside, etc. And why are we going to deprive the Palestinians of fighting apartheid in the way that it was done in South Africa? And I think to start quibbling with whether it's, you know, the right strategy or not, when in fact it was a very important strategy in getting rid of apartheid in South Africa, they should have the right to do that. So I know, I'm sure that even, you know, in the South African context, there were various groups who were fighting apartheid who, you know, if you looked at who they were, one wouldn't like them necessarily. But you know, the Palestinians, as I understand it, they try and have a broad coalition around this. And I think that they have every right to use BDS, which is fundamentally a non-violent form of protest. They should be able to use that to fight their oppression.
I mean, we are not those who judge who has the right to choose which strategy, but we are, particularly if we are friends, I think very legitimately concerned about strategies who lead into failure. And the problem with BDS, and that's not my personal view, and you don't have to share that, but is that it's a complete failure because the situation is different from South Africa. And South Africa was never a holy cow, but Israel is a holy cow. And the situation in Israel is different from South Africa, but particularly the major success the BDS movement seems to have is when it's not about weapons and economy, but it's about academic and cultural relations, in which I think it becomes toxic. I mean, that's my personal view. So I think it's not anti-Semitic. It's simply a nationalist counter strategy against another nationalism, which is Zionism, which is not, in my view, is not helping.
Explain to me then
not
why,
helping the Palestinians, not helping anybody.
Explain to me then why Israel is spending millions and millions and millions of dollars on fighting BDS around the world.
I can tell you. My idea about it is that's the best invested money Israel ever had to find alliances all over the world that help them to stabilize the kind of status quo they want.
Well, I think
the fight against BDS is the best gift that could ever be done to the Israeli government. So they got what they wanted. They pay money into a lot of things that are useful for them. And fighting BDS worldwide is their glue to all these nationalists and anti-democratic forces that we have all over the world, in Austria or in Germany or in Great Britain or in the US. But we don't need to be consistent.
This isn't our fight.
There are other questions, just to have that before we make an end to that, because we all need to make a point. But at least I want to do justice to the last questions here in the Facebook and Zoom dialogue. Is Israel's support for the IHRA definition a sign of strength or weakness? Does it reflect the weakness of progressives, or is it a response to their perceived strength? This is a question by Harold Emanuel.
Right, my friend Harold.
You know him?
Oh, yes.
He has another question. Is Israel and the occupation today the cause rather than the victim of anti-Semitism? So you know him. Any answer to Harold Emanuel?
Sorry, what was the first question was?
Is Israel's support for the IHRA definition a sign of strength or weakness?
A sign of weakness.
I have another comment by Hanna Spierglas from Switzerland. Oh, there is a huge difference between having a dialogue between the two sides in questions, looking for an improvement, and an outsider of the conflict who is flirting just with one side and trivializing their violence. So this is a comment to your comment on Corbyn.
The notion that there are two sides in this conflict as if they're equal, which is what that seems to be based on, I think is a total misnomer. There aren't two equal sides. There's a very, very, very powerful side, and then there's a very, very weak side. And that is the reality of the situation. It's so often portrayed as it's war between two equals almost. It's not. It's more like an elephant and a mouse, if I can put it that way. Maybe a slight exaggeration, but that is fundamentally the reality of the situation.
There's another question by Laila Al-Subaidi. Second question, if I may, could you outline some of the strategies that you believe to be the most constructive? Ending on a positive note.
Well, it depends what they mean strategies for. If it's strategies for fighting anti-Semitism and real ones that get to what you referred to at the beginning, white supremacy and Trump and all of these kinds of things, then sorry, I've lost my train of thought here, but I think that there are ways of fighting real anti-Semitism by working with other groups who are also affected by racisms, working together with them, and not, which is, I think, the way very much IHRA directs, and that is a sort of exclusivist, exceptionalist Jewish way of dealing with it. We have to work with other allies to get to real anti-Semitism. And also, finally, we have to try and undermine and break the discourse of new anti-Semitism, the discourse of the collective Jew, as fully as we possibly can, and open up a new kind of discourse which presents a positive future for both Jews and Palestinians in the area from the river to the sea.
There's another comment, just two little notes from the net, and then we finish, but it's helpful. And there's something ending on some humor, which is Eric Haywood from Dublin, who says, do Jews not boycott? My Jewish mother was a firm believer in boycotting. We boycotted Germany until the 1960s. My mother fell out of love with Israel when it decided no longer to boycott Wagner. We still do. Okay, I'm not commenting on that. My father always loved Wagner, my Jewish father. And there is a last question by Michaela Kopser-Mark, who just wanted to know something you maybe don't know the answer to, and is how the IHRA definition was acknowledged or approved by the German Bundestag. And how did that come, and who was involved? I mean, there's just one little note that I give you here as a little ending comment. It was the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, that was threatening the Bundestag by giving as a resolution into the process that the AfD, as the biggest friend of Israel, asks the other parties to adopt the IHRA definition, but not only that, to legally forbid to make BDS illegal in Germany. I mean, to make it a criminal case. And at that point, the other parties in the Bundestag, at least the majority of them, adopted the IHRA definition because they did not want to be outdone by the AfD in their love and loyalty to Israel. That is part of the sad story. But let's end on the debate on Wagner, but we can continue that with a glass of wine.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody. Thank you, Tony. Ach,